Today, 523 years ago, after a 2-year-long campaign, the conquistador Hernan Cortés, after 78 days of siege, manages to conquer the capital city of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, and with the first European map ever of the city being sent back to its emperor, it was mentioned Cortés and his men wondered if they were dreaming when they saw the beauty of the city. Now for today, we are not getting many pretty things, we are getting more balance tuning. Apparently Blizzard in the past couple of weeks have gotten in the mood of not really updating the beta with all of these changes, but rather scattering the updates bit by bit over a couple of days. What we have first is the very small AoE nerf to Frostfire of Mage. Excess Frost is being nerfed. This is the freebie AoE ability you get to cast when you cap your Frost Mastery of Frostfire, which gets you to cast a free Ice Nova at 200% damage. This 200% damage is now being nerfed to 125% effectiveness for both Frost and Fire. So it's a slight nerf in AoE, not nearly as much of an effect in single target, of course, because Ice Nova is primarily good for doing AoE damage, and not actually much else being given to Mage. What is being given to Monk is a bit more interesting, because Monk gets their Mastery buffed. Why this is interesting is because for a long time, many players have known and associated Monk with being a meme when it comes to scaling, when it comes to being powerful the deeper you go down in a season or the deeper you go down in an expansion, because you lack any kind of synergy with secondary stats. Monk was one of the typical specs you needed to have them bailed out by Blizzard with borrowed powers. And the default passive way many other specs can get stronger deeper into a season or an expansion is with secondary stats. For example, an extremely easy way to show this is when you look at Beast Mastery, you have this talent, Wild Call. Your auto-shot critical strikes have a chance to reset the cooldown of Barb Shot. This means that as you go deeper into a season, number one, if you get more haste, you attack faster, which means you attack more times, giving you more chances to crit, meaning Wild Call has more chances to reset. Number two, if you have more crit, then your auto shots simply have more chance to crit, meaning you have more chances to reset the cooldown of Barb Shot. This is a passive ability that scales with secondary stats. So you start the expansion, you ding max level, and you have like 6% haste and 8% crit, and it feels horrible. And then halfway through the expansion, you have 35% haste and 40% crit. Suddenly, with those stats, this passive is much stronger, because it has way more chances to reset the cooldown of Barbershot. But Windwalker didn't really have much of any of this. Recently, though, in this expansion, Blizzard has gone to work to give Windwalker Monk multiple ways to scale with their secondaries. For example, Fist of Fury now doing more damage based on your haste. Then you also have your Rising Sun Kick having a chance equal to your haste to hit again and give you back 1 chi. So this makes you scale better with haste, for example. And now you have this buff which also gives you better scaling with your mastery. It is a pretty good kind of buffs to give to a spec, especially a spec that didn't have nearly as much scaling with their secondary stats as Windwalker Monks had. Then we have a rather confusing chain, which is the one to Demon Hunter in one of their hero talents, Fel Scarred. So right now, the thing about Fel Scarred, as we can also see in the sims, is that they are simming quite a lot lower than Aldrachi Reaver when it comes to single target, but they are actually now, after the several buffs they received, very close, if not even ahead, in Mythic Plus, in AoE damage, because they are centered a lot around burst, around AoE burst with their Demon Surge whenever they enter Metamorphosis, which gives them very good burst damage in AoE, which is perfect for Mythic Plus, of course. What's the problem? The problem is that Burning Blades gets nerfed and Demon Surge gets buffed. Why this is somewhat weird is because your typical Demon Hunter, Vengeance or Havoc in Mythic Plus is going to benefit the most from Demon Surge, way more so than Burning Blades, because Burning Blades works off of Troglaive and Chaos Strike. But Troglaive and Chaos Strike in particular, are primarily single target abilities. Meanwhile, your Demon Surge is the effect that makes you explode for damage in AoE. So the confusion comes from you being already good in AoE and having your strength of this hero talent being the AoE damage you can do, and your AoE damage is being buffed by 15%. Demon Surge is getting buffed by 15%, while at the same time the Burning Blaze, which was better for single target than it was for AoE, definitely better than Demon Surge in single target, is being nerfed by almost half, by almost 50%. That is the somewhat confusing part about these buffs. You would have expected, in fact, the opposite. You would have expected perhaps this one to get buffed even more, and this one to get nerfed a bit more. So it is a bit of a head-scratching change given to Fel Scarred Demon Hunter. Very slight change to Mistweaver Monk. Vivify is buffed by 20% after being nerfed before, and then Restoral and Revival, both of the types of cooldown they have, is being buffed by 15%. Nothing too off about this. These are not particularly powerful cooldowns, so a good 15% buff is okay to have. Today, then we have the nerf of the day. The nerf of the day is to Restoration Druid. I'm pretty happy about this change because I was first in line when we were talking about the power of the healers. I was first in line mentioning, okay, it's somewhat understandable to nerf Resto Shaman like they did, but we should kind of need to put the other ones at the top in line with these nerfs. So now we have gotten the nerfs of Holy Paladin already, and now we are getting the ones to Restoration Druid. The number one nerf out of these, not really the ones to Death Touch or Swiftman, but the 22% healing nerf given to Regrowth. We touched on this before, how powerful Regrowth had become. You know, Regrowth now healing for 1 million in the base version, not even counting the hot it leaves behind, but just the actual healing of Regrowth can get close to or above 1 million. And it was becoming very effective. Regrowth was starting to match or even pass the healing, for example, of Holy Shock, which was in the realm of the, again, same, the 1 million healing. You also had specs like Restoration Shaman, where Riptide was less than half of the healing of a Regrowth. It's definitely good to still have Regrowth powerful, because as we touched on the last time, Regrowth, first of all, it's going to be your main spot healing ability in Mythic Plus. It's going to be your main tool in Mythic Plus, way more so than Reju. But even in the raid, it was giving you different alternatives. You could still play the old Druid style, which is very similar to Discipline Priest, the ramping Resto Druid with Flourish. But then you could also do your consistent style of healing. No Flourish, no cooldowns with spikes of healing, and more consistent uses of Regrowth, as well as playing with double Life Bloom instead of Flourish, giving you way more healing with Life Bloom as well. You can see here the top healing of this Druid never even touches, barely once touches 2 million HPS, and that's with Trunk. Right, that's the max that this build can get with 1.1 million HPS. This one is the same healing, and it breaks 3 million HPS every ramp. So the result of the healing is the same, it's just that one is more spiky and the other one is more consistent, and this one was helped a lot by the buff to Regrowth, but it was a bit too much. So perhaps nerf Regrowth and redistribute the power to somewhere else in Resto Druid. However, for now there isn't much redistribution other than just nerfs, because Grove Guardians gets nerfed by 10%. Not just Grove Guardians passive healing, but also the extra buff of Wild Synthesis, the AoE healing they also do, is nerfed by 10%, as well as the power of Life Bloom is nerfed by 10% as well, which is irrelevant if you are healing this way, because you don't barely even benefit from Life Bloom. It's more relevant if you're playing the double Life Bloom Photosynthesis version. That is a more significant buff. And then, similar to Mistweaver, they get their poor cooldown, Tranquility, buffed by 10%. I would say, just like I said about Resto Shaman, it was a warranted nerf. Just like I said about Holy Paladin as well, and just like I will say about Preservation Evoker whenever they get nerfed. Then we have the changes to Holy Paladin. This one is a bit more confusing. We have the damage buff, 40+% damage buff to Crusader Strike. The reason why this is a quite poor type of buff is because right now the damage of Holy Paladin is very weak. If I were to make a tier list based on the hundreds of Mythic Plus logs we have seen in the past couple of days, Holy Paladin is quite comfortably the weakest of the healers. Preservation Evoker is quite comfortably the strongest of the healers when it comes to DPS. They can break 300,000 DPS in Mythic Plus keys. Restoration Druids and Restoration Shamans can get above 200,000, whereas the other three healers are kind of stuck in this 150k-ish limbo, with Holy Paladin being the worst. You have to put effort on Resto Druid to get close to 300,000 by getting into cat form and actually working your ass off. It's not the case for Preservation Evoker. Preservation Evoker just needs like one button right now, Fire Breath, and be Chrono Warden to get the Chrono Flames out for extra free damage. You know, this is a 356,000 DPS in a 12, and it's doing 280,000 just with these two effects. Another key, another 350,000, and 320 is again just out of these two. Same goes with a different key, 300,000, mostly these effects. Then you have Resto Shaman having way more trouble because their Healing Rain is most of what they do, is not nearly as powerful. They would have to start actually using their Chain Lightning way more often to be able to get past 200,000 DPS. But, however, Holy Paladin is the worst. Their damage is very low. Right now, the power of their only consistent AoE abilities they have, Consecration and Shield of the Righteous with their Herald of the Sun effects, is just too weak. You know, when your entire toolkit of damage is 110,000, which is lower or even to just one ability of Evoker, just Fire Breath, that is not looking too good for you. And that's why buffing Crusader Strike is not that relevant, because you don't care too much about single target damage as a healer, and this is not gonna move anything when it comes to AoE, this buff to Crusader Strike. So that's why it's a bit of a confusing buff. If you wanted to buff the AoE damage of Holy Paladin, then you would have had to go for actual AoE abilities. Now, this is nothing. You're not getting buffed by 5%. Actually, you were supposed to be buffed by 5% a couple of weeks ago, but Blizzard forgot. So this 5% buff to your damage abilities of Discipline is what you were supposed to be getting a couple of weeks ago. So that's it, unfortunately. It's not a 10% buff, 5 from last week and 5 from this week. It's the same buff you were supposed to be getting a week ago. Lastly, we have the more confusing of the changes. This one is to Deathstalker. Now, going back to the Sims. Right now, we don't even have very updated logs of Assassination. They are quite old, but rumors in the corridors are saying Assassination is very powerful, and it is likely going to be simming as soon as the APL is ready, quite reasonably high, and Deathstalker right now is quite reasonably powerful for Assassination. Because even though, true, we don't have a working APL to get out how much damage are they doing right now in single target, what we can see is how this AoE, Deathstalker Rogue build, is doing in Mythic Plus. And what it's doing in Mythic Plus is quite the good damage at the moment as an Assassination Rogue. So we can still point out what are the strong points of this build and the strong points of that Stalker. That's why it is somewhat confusing to see that, okay, first of all, the first change is irrelevant. You don't do damage with Ambush or Mutilate anyways, so buffing the effect is whatever. This is completely irrelevant. Fatal Intent is also quite weak in terms of effect, in terms of power. So I understand buffing it because it's weak, but it's not really going to be too relevant. Follow the Blood would be understandable as a buff because it's the one you never take, because momentum of the spell is much stronger. So you're like, of course we are buffing the weak one, so it becomes a better option, right? It becomes completely pointless when you also buff momentum of the spell, which was already the better choice, and this buff is actually also bigger than this buff. So you are buffing the one you are always taking even more than the weak option you were never taking. Hunt them down, making your auto attacks doing extra damage is also completely irrelevant. Your auto attack damage is nothing in your build, it doesn't matter if you do more damage with it. And then, even more confusingly, Lingering Darkness gets buffed even more. This is a very powerful extra if you can line it up with your burst. After Deathmark, getting 30 seconds of 30% increased nature damage. This is relevant because look at the nature damage. nature damage, nature damage, nature damage, nature damage, all buffed by 30% during that window. So we are talking about over 10% damage buff for 30 seconds every time you use Deathmark. That's the confusing part. Perhaps Blizzard has some data we don't have where they have decided Deathstalker Mark right now is weak, not at least looking at the results in Mythic Plus, where it's doing great for Assassination Rogue, so that is a bit of a confusing point to buff this hero talent, as Assassination Rogue right now looks like to be doing very well. Despite right now not having accurate logs out or anything, the real in-game results are looking very good for Assassination. So these were all of the combined changes in the past day or so given out by Blizzard. Not nearly as many. If you might have noticed, compared to all of the previous weeks of changes, these ones were quite small. Maybe today, on this Tuesday, on the reset, we will have even more changes, but for now, this is what was available in terms of hotfixes for the beta. So, for today, on this Tuesday, it is now time to leave each other. Thanks, of course, everyone for having watched the video, as well as everyone else who is supporting for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, for once, I finish a video without having my throat being parched, without having my nose starting to itch. Nothing going wrong for once. Great.